My name is John Lobell, and these are very brief descriptions of lectures I can give on cruise ships, and these are 5 lectures on modern architecture. So first is Frank Lloyd Wright, the man in his buildings. What a fascinating person and what a creative force. We'll do a brief bio of Wright and see he was born in 1867, just 2 years after the end of the Civil War, died in 1959, just 2 years before John F. Kennedy announced that we would be going to the moon. He built buildings all across the United States, and he lived through this huge change, born into an agrarian world, grew up in a world of explosive industrialization, and experienced Chicago having 150,000 people when he was born, 700,000 when he arrived to work there, and 1,900,000 when he opened his own office. There were 5 very important women in Wright's life, his mother, and then Catherine, his first wife, Mama Cheney, who was tragically murdered. We'll hear about that. A disastrous brief marriage to Maud, and then Olgavana, who took care of him for the latter part of his life. He began his career with a series of prairie-style houses. We'll see what the prairie-style was. Very modern, low-sloped, overhanging roofs, interpenetrating plains, open plan, one space flowing into another, and very technologically adventurous buildings, such as Unity Temple, a concrete building, and a very cubic geometric interior. He did falling water, which we've all heard of, integrated into its landscape. By the 1930s, Wright had become forgotten. This building relaunched him into global recognition, along with Johnson Wax headquarters and its amazing lily pad column interior. Around the same time in the 30s, he does the first Jacobs house for $5,500, exploring how houses can be much more economical. And at the end of his career, does the Price Tower, one of his very few skyscrapers, and the Guggenheim Museum. And we'll look at his concept of flowing space that we see in the Guggenheim Museum. We'll look at his notion of organic architecture and 3 or 4 meanings that he gave to the term organic architecture, and then look at the span of his life. So here's the Ward Willett House, 1900, looking very modern. In fact, there's a Mercedes-Benz in the driveway that we can't see, but this is the car that the owners would have had. And then this is the car that was current when he did the Guggenheim Museum. So he saw an evolution of a lot of things in our lives. At the time he was born, they were just completing the Transcontinental Railroad. By the time he died, he had been flying in Boeing 707 jet airliners. This is his first house on his own. You go through that archway, and in the back are stables. They didn't have a car, they had horses. And on the right is a project, wasn't built, for a mile-high building with atomic-powered elevators. So that's the span of change that Wright lived through. You can see my full lecture on Frank Lloyd Wright, the man in his buildings, on this website, and quite a few lectures by me on Frank Lloyd Wright. I teach a course in Frank Lloyd Wright on YouTube. I do a lecture, What Was Modern Architecture? It's over. We're in a totally different period now. But what was modern architecture? It was part of modernism, and I'll summarize modernism as a change from, rather than understanding human beings and society through tradition, we change to understand human beings and society through rationality and science. Beaux-Arts architecture, traditional architecture, and you might know the National Gallery on the top left in Washington, D.C., See how this is based on the Roman Pantheon from 125 AD. So it's embedded in tradition. And then on the bottom, I have a picture of the Bauhaus from the 1920s, and modern architecture was designed from program rather than tradition and rooted in functionality. So we'll look at that contrast, and then we'll see how modernism is rooted in a scientific understanding and control of humans and society that we see with Charles Darwin and evolution, Karl Marx and scientific socialism, Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalysis of the unconscious. And built on these modernist thinkers, modern architects envisioned a new way of life, one that would provide us light, clean air, hygiene, open space, and a rational organization of human activities. So that's what Le Corbusier was thinking of when he proposed tearing down historic Paris and building his tower. Frank Lloyd Wright will be one of the modern architects that we look at. We'll see his career beginning with the Prairie style and these geometrically abstract buildings. The National Gallery and traditional architecture have put the human being in the center, whereas Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie style pushes the human being out of the center, which is now occupied by the chimney core, in a Copernican revolution to have us join with nature in moving around the center rather than being in the center and observing nature. We'll look at Frank Lloyd Wright's organic architecture in Falling Water. Then we'll look at Mies van der Rohe. Mies is associated with a bunch of quotes: The Glass Skyscraper, Less is More, Skin and Bones, and most famously, God is in the Details. We'll look at Mies's Seagram building in New York, not the first, but an early and pioneering glass skyscraper. And we'll see this idea, God is in the details, and we'll see how the spacing of the columns on the exterior of three different buildings. In one case, the column is outside of the building. In one case, it's embedded in the exterior wall. And then in the bottom case, the column is inside the building. And these led to really tedious problems that Mies struggled with. And yes, he really was wrapped up in details. Then we'll look at Le Corbusier, Swiss-French architect. And his most important early building is the Villa Savoie. And he raises it up on columns that he calls pilotis. He has a free plan in which the walls can go anywhere he wants because the columns are doing the support. He can have long windows because the exterior wall is no longer doing the supporting. That's being done by the columns. We'll look at Le Corbusier's Voisin plan for Paris, and then at his later work, which is far more sculptural than the early work, a big break from what he had been doing earlier here in Ronchamp. We'll look at Walter Gropius, who was as important as an educator as he was as an architect. He gave us the Bauhaus. He founded the Bauhaus and also did its building. And we'll talk about how the Bauhaus embodies and represents modern architecture. And these are some of the things designed at the Bauhaus. These things are almost 100 years old and still looking totally modern. And then we'll see what happens when this modern architecture comes to America. Here, the Lever Building by Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, the first all-glass skyscraper. And then we'll have some fun and look at some modern architecture that was not in the books when I was a student. We teach it now, but they sure never showed that to us when I was a student. So here is Green and Green, around the same time as the early Frank Lloyd Wright work, and it's an arts and crafts house with this incredibly rich, sumptuous wood interior. Here is Gaudí in Spain, this incredibly colorful architecture. Here is Futurism, Saint-Ilia in before World War I, this very modernistic architecture. Here is Constructivism in Russia, right after the revolution, very lightweight, very interesting architecture. And then we come to question modern architecture. Do we really need these skyscrapers marching through our cities? And then we get some alternatives, like Eero Saarinen's TWA building of 1962. And we'll end by talking about some criticisms of modern architecture. A whole bunch of books in the late 60s came out on the failure of modern architecture, and we'll see what their critiques were. So, you can see my full lecture on what was modern architecture on this site and on YouTube. I do a lecture on what was postmodern architecture. So, with the questioning of modern architecture in the mid to late 1960s, a whole series of alternatives came along that moved away from the idealism and functionality of modern architecture and proposed something much more, shall we say, aesthetic. So modernism could be defined as having a faith in reason and science as a means of knowing reality, culminating in the Enlightenment and modern social science, and postmodernism characterized by a cynicism toward reason and science. So we'll look very briefly at postmodernism as a general cultural movement. It's associated with a series of French thinkers, primarily Derrida. We'll look at their ideas and how they come to influence architecture. And then we'll look at a series of architects. We'll start with a group of New York architects that were called the Five: Eisenman, Graves, Gwathmey, Haydock, and Meyer. Peter Eisenman did a series of houses that were deliberately totally not practical, but were illustrative of his linguistic theories. John Haydock did very poetic houses. This is called the Wall House. One part of this family doesn't get along with the other, and there's a concrete wall showing that not getting along. This is Michael Graves playing with imagery from Le Corbusier. You might have known Graves' tea kettles, used to be available at Target. And down on the lower right is a building he did for Disney with caryatids. The seven dwarves are acting as columns. One of my teachers, Robert Venturi, married to Denise Scott Brown, and Venturi is sometimes referred to as the father of postmodernism, although he doesn't like the term. He wrote a book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. We'll talk about that. And then here's a house he did for his mother, and see how different it is from Le Corbusier's Villa Savoie, which is abstract, rectilinear, and Venturi's mother's house reminds us of a house. It has a sloped roof. There's a phrase, the house as any child would draw it. And you would, if you ask a child to draw a house, you might even get a mother in there. And there's Venturi's mother in front of his house. This is a fire station he did. Well, how do you know this is a fire station? Well, there's a sign on it that says fire station. That's how you know. There's a lot of humor in postmodern architecture. Then finally, we'll look at where we are today. This is a painter named Julian Schnabel, also a prominent filmmaker. And at one point, he was asked a question, how do you see your work in relationship to Clement Greenberg's notions of color field painters and post-painterly abstraction? And his response was, I don't think we talk that way anymore. He is interested in experience. So the architect Frank Gehry is noted for the comment, let the experience begin. And Frank Gehry we know for the Bilbao Museum. So we're in a period now that's not theoretical, it's just exuberant. Here's another Frank Gehry building, Walt Disney Concert Hall. Here's a building at MIT by Frank Gehry. Zaha Hadid just died quite young doing this very angular architecture. And then one of my favorites, Santiago Calatrava, did the New York Downtown Transportation Hub, which has just opened. And so how do we feel about today's architecture? Some buildings here you might recognize. We'll look briefly at all of them, and then we might discuss how we feel about this architecture. So you can see my full lecture, What was Postmodern Architecture, on this site and on YouTube. The architecture of Louis Kahn. Louis Kahn is sometimes described as the second most important American architect after Frank Lloyd Wright. He was born in 1901, died in 1974. He blossomed late, so it wasn't until the 1960s he did the medical towers at the University of Pennsylvania that brought him broad recognition, and he contrasted his work to the modern architecture of the day. The Seagram building was being built around the same time as his building. He was critical of it. His is very articulated, unlike the Seagram building, which is all in a neat box. Kahn's is like all over the place. And there's a reason for that. He starts with saying that you need an area, flexible open area for science where the lab desks are, and then offices around that. So as the scientist wants to go to the light to work on their notes, you need structure to hold that up. You need egress, air conditioning ducts, fire stairs, and that gives you these service elements, and then you put that all together, you get the building. So he arrives at his building quite rationally, and it's put together out of precast concrete. Very interesting process. We'll go into a little detail how he did that. And then everything I just told you, you see every time you go into the building. His next important building was the Salk Institute for Jonas Salk, who had developed the polio vaccine, and very spiritually powerful building with this plaza that's like a cathedral without a ceiling. He did the Kimball Art Museum with these very Roman-like vault forms and that sort of spread the light from the light fixtures in the center. He did the Yale Center for British Art with this giant light space at the entrance. And he is also known for the National Assembly building, which is quite prominently featured in an important movie, My Architect, by his son Nathaniel Kahn. It's an Academy Award nominated movie, and it presents both a biography of Kahn and looks at his buildings. If you're in New York, you might want to visit his FDR Memorial on Roosevelt Island, and I'll also look at Kahn's philosophy. He works with a metaphor of silence and light. Silence is a realm of potential where the building resides before the architect brings it into manifestation in the realm of light. And then his materials, he'll speak to each material and ask what it wants. Kahn's philosophy is very similar to that of the American architect Louis Sullivan. Sullivan says, "The germ is the real thing, the seat of identity. Within its delicate mechanism lies the will to power, the function which is to seek and eventually to find its full expression in form." So we'll see what these architects mean when they speak like that. And Kahn writes, "A work is made in the urging sound of industry, and when the dust settles, the pyramid, echoing silence, gives the sun its shadow." So you can see my full lecture on the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright on this site and on YouTube. The radical architecture of the 60s. Well, the 60s was a cool time in a lot of ways. Music, culture, and some really great stuff in architecture. So the establishment was giving us the Seagram building, these boxy office buildings, and maybe some little bit more in the TWA terminal. We're starting to break free of those boxes and be a little bit more expressive. And coming into that world was a group of English architects just out of school, and they decided they were going to publish their work in their own publication which would be in comic book style. The amazing archigram. And their most famous drawing, because that's what they did, drawings. Their most famous drawing, and that's what they did, drawings, is Plug-in City. And so you see a kind of infrastructure framework, and then here's a crane delivering somebody's apartment unit. You get a new car every couple of years. Why don't you get a new apartment every couple of years? And here's Walking City, having crossed the Atlantic. It's coming into New York. And then, to build a futurist city would be a lot of work. Why don't we just drop some bed sheets down from a dirigible and use projectors and project onto it? Or you could take a pill that would generate, it's all in the mind, the Enviro pill, generate whole environments. This is another architect from those times, Friedrich von Florian, and here's exploring the holding patterns of airplanes as there are structures in the air. This is an architect, Hans Hollein, and he's proposing that, an aircraft carrier is like a city. We could put that in a landscape. This is an Italian group, Super Studio, proposing structures to span the globe. And in the United States, we had some pretty cool stuff going on. So any discussion in the United States of the 50s would have to, of course, begin with the automobile and the origin of the tail fin, leading eventually to this monstrosity. And then all of a sudden, something else comes along, a whole new kind of thinking. And so here on the left is Watson and an IBM computer. On the right is Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and the first Apple computer. What kind of new world is starting to emerge here? There's revolutionary politics. There's the sexual revolution. There's feminism. There's New Age. There's psychedelics. There's rock music. There's the ecology movement. There's 60s art, Andy Warhol, and the soup cans. So what comes about in architecture during this period? Well, we get a rediscovery of Bucky Fuller. He's already doing exciting stuff in the 1920s, but in the 1960s, he becomes a hero of the New Age youth, and he's proposing prefabricated aluminum houses, putting a bubble dome over Manhattan. He does the American Pavilion, one of his geodetic domes, at Expo 67. He proposes that we should see the Earth as a spaceship. We also have some humorous young architects like Ant Farm, who name themselves after this little plastic thing you could get, and you could watch ants building their tunnels in there. And they would do this instant architecture of inflated. You just heat seal some plastic sheets and back a fan into it, and you've got an instant building. This is their Cadillac Ranch, which you might see if you drive across Texas. Every Cadillac from 49 to 63, all the history of the tail fins. At that time, we have architecture like Marcia Softy's Habitat at Expo 67. And this is something I did, some environmental sculpture, and I was curator of a program that did dial-a-poem, so the architecture becomes ephemeral and is patterns woven through phone lines. So you can see my full lecture on the radical architecture of the 60s on this website and on YouTube.